Welcome to the Pursuit Zone Adventure Travel Podcast. I am your host, Paul Schmid, and I interview modern-day explorers from around the globe to bring you their exciting stories. These are people that dream big, break out of their comfort zones, and take on ambitious pursuits. This is episode 152 with Daniel Alvarez. You might remember Daniel from episode 5, which aired as an encore episode 2 weeks ago, where he talked about his long-distance kayaking adventure. Well, Daniel's back to talk about his long-distance hiking adventure through Europe. But before we get to that, if you want to send me a message, you can email me at paul@thepursuitzone.com or leave me a voice message at speakpipe.com/thepursuitzone. And now, let me introduce my guest. In the summer of 2017, Daniel Alvarez finished a very long walk across Europe. He started at the top of Norway and continued south across Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal, following the various trails including Sweden's King's Trail and the Camino de Santiago. It was a year-long journey covering over 6,000 miles, and he writes about this adventure and others at his website, predictablylost.com. Daniel previously appeared in episode 5 talking about his long-distance kayaking adventure from Minnesota to Florida. Daniel Alvarez, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and great that you've kept up this podcast. Yeah, fantastic to be here.
Well, I know it's been, almost 5 years since we spoke, and I'm just kind of curious, in a nutshell, you don't have to give us the entire story, but, what have you been up to in the last 5 years?
Well, after I finished the kayak trip, I was pretty exhausted, both physically and mentally. And so I rested a bit. I rode a lot. I tried to figure out what to do with my life. I went on a couple of, smaller adventure trips, like a 800-mile hike in New Mexico and Arizona called the Grand Enchantment Trail. And eventually I got the bug to go on another really long hike. And that kind of brought me to the Europe hike.
Why Europe? I mean, were you also thinking of, was there a second choice or a third choice?
Well, I've done a lot of hiking in the United States, like the Triple Crown. And so I wanted to see what it would be like to try and do a long distance hike in another continent. I thought a little bit about New Zealand because they have a trail there that goes across the country. But something about Europe was just really attracted to me because of the history and the fact that you'd cross so many different countries. And a long time ago, I had met a guy who had cross-country skied across Norway. And for some reason, that had always stuck in my mind as something that would be interesting to do. I'm not the skiing part, just Norway. And so it just kind of happened. I don't know. I was like, once I put it together, and I'd always wanted to hike the Camino de Santiago. So it just seemed like a natural fit to work it into this whole trip.
Why do you think that the New Zealand trail, because New Zealand's pretty awesome, how did that take second place?
It's still on the list of something I'd like to do one day, but I wanted a little bit longer trip, and I wanted more culture and more diversity. So in New Zealand, you'd be in one country versus if you go to Europe, I crossed, I think, 11 countries. So I wanted a slightly different experience. It wouldn't have been bad to be in New Zealand either. I would not have cried about that.
What was your goal, or what was your objective for the Europe walk?
Basically, I wanted to cross the continent on foot from one end to the other, from the northernmost point to the southernmost point. And similar to like the trails in the United States that go from the Mexican border to the Canadian border, I think it's really interesting to cross large distances in a continuous path, because you really get to see the terrain change, the culture change. And so I wanted to try that in Europe. That was basically the goal, is put your heels on the Arctic Ocean in Norway and finish up at the Mediterranean in Spain. So yeah, that was the objective. It was the adventure of it, and just see what happens.
So you're already an experienced long distance hiker, Triple Crown. So I mean, you already know what goes into planning. So did that help you in any way decrease the amount of time you had to put into planning? Were you ready to just pick up and go to Europe and start walking? Or, what was your planning process for this?
It definitely helped to have the experience that I have. It's about confidence more than anything, is that I was confident that, whatever gear I took, I could make work and I could figure out how to problem solve along the way. The biggest difference in planning is that all the U.S. trails, at least the major ones, have extensive planning guides. People have done these trips many times, and there's lots and lots of resources. This trail, it wasn't really a trail. It was more just like my own route and combination of trails. Some pieces have that kind of infrastructure that's set up and you can really find easily good information. Like when you get to the Camino de Santiago, it's very easy as far as planning goes, but other parts were just total mysteries. But knowing that, I had the experience from previous trails, that basically what you're trying to do is plan for the next time you're going to be able to get food. If you're in a desert, it's the next time you're going to get water. But basically, you just need to keep planning little segments as you go. Yeah, it was helpful to have the confidence. I didn't do a whole lot of planning. There's a route called the E1 route that goes from the northern tip of Norway down to Sicily and Italy. And so I thought I'd follow that for a while, as much as I could, into Germany, maybe France, maybe Italy, and then turn to the west and head towards Spain and pick up on the Camino de Santiago routes from there. But that was about all I had as a GPS track. It wasn't very extensive at all. And I just figured I'd figure it out along the way. I know I can carry about 10 days of food if I have to, and there has to be a way to do it. So that's about all the planning I did. The other big difference between Europe and the United States is in the United States, I'm very used to, where to find gear, what stores have what I want, how to ship it to wherever I need to pick it up. But in Europe, it becomes much more difficult because I don't understand the postal system over there as well. I don't know what's the REI of Europe, and so that was logistically challenging for me. Also, language barriers. It's hard to figure out what even to Google search or something. But yeah, I mean, mostly I just went into it with the idea of this is an adventure and you'll figure it out as you go.
I know Germany's got some decent outdoor stores. What did you end up having to shop at any, and what was your experience?
I didn't actually. I did pretty good with my equipment. Held up real well on this trip. I had to get shoes every once in a while. Germany does have some good outdoor stores. In fact, I mean, pretty much everywhere has good outdoor stores in Europe, at least where I was. It's just a matter of like finding them as someone who doesn't know what to look for even. But mostly it was about replacing shoes. That was the biggest piece of gear I had to go through.
What kind of shoes were you wearing?
Pretty much always trail running shoes of some sort. My feet are pretty forgiving, so as long as I get one that's about my size, it's good. I did get stuck in northern Sweden and Norway. I got stuck because I had to replace my shoes because my first pair was falling apart, and I went to the store and they had literally 2 pairs of shoes that were in my size, and one of them just wasn't going to work. It was just way too light, and then the other one was a walking shoe. It was just walking, not very flat soles, so no real grip. So I had to just go with this walking shoe, and it was a while. It actually. I fell a few times because these shoes just could not grab the ground, and it was pretty wet and muddy up there. But I just kept telling myself it's part of the adventure. I think someone who has a better planner would probably do a little better on the footwear, but I ended up really liking those shoes. They were pretty good in the end.
Was this because you have like giant feet, or because the store had no selection?
I have pretty big feet. I found that after long distance hiking, my feet have gotten bigger. I think because they just get flattened out a little bit or something. I don't really know, but I've gone up a couple of sizes. So my feet are just big, and so they're just difficult to. And it's a really small. I mean, in northern Sweden and Norway, you're talking about very small towns. So it's not like gigantic shopping centers that have anything you need. So yeah, there just wasn't a lot of selection up there in my size.
Why go north to south?
Well, I thought that the biggest danger on the trip would be somehow ending up in the north of Europe during winter. And so I thought if I went north to south, I could start in the early, I started, I think, June 21st. So it's pretty much as early as you can go because you're really far north. I mean, you're way above the Arctic Circle up there. And that way I could get out of the north. I could control the timing in the north. You don't really want to be in Spain during the summer hiking around because it's really hot, but it's more like that's an uncomfortable thing versus it's like frozen solid up there in the winter. So it's like, I don't think I have I'm not a snow person, so I don't have the skills to deal with that kind of stuff. So that's why I went north to south, which is weird because in the US, I've always gone north on all my trips instead of south. But it was, different experience. Also, another good reason to go south was because I wanted to incorporate the Camino de Santiago into the trip. It allowed me to walk the Camino in the traditional direction and way from the Camino Frances, which is the main route.
You write a lot about your trip on your blog, predictablylost.com, and I was only able to read about 25% of it. But I would encourage people to go check it out because there's some great writing in there. But I did happen to read about your experience starting at the north, and that there's like 3 competing places for the northernmost point. Can you tell us about that and why you chose all 3?
Basically, there's 3 arguments. 2 of them are decent arguments, and one of them is not really great, but it's convenient. So if you think like the northernmost point of Europe, you can either think of the mainland Europe's northernmost point, which is this place called Kinneroden. I'm probably going to butcher these names. I apologize to any native Norwegian speakers. But this place called Kinneroden is the northernmost point of the mainland. But then there's a point that's slightly farther north that's on an island. And this island has 2 points. One's accessible by road. That's just called North Cape, which is like the most popular place. But on the same island, if you hike, you can go to a point that's even farther north on the island called Nifsjellodden. It depends if you want to include this little island as part of the mainland in terms of what's farther north, what counts as the northernmost point of Europe. I decided to go to all 3 because I thought, why not? I'm up there. I don't know if I'll ever be in Norway again. It's just more fun time spent up in the tundra, walking around and exploring. If I had to give a recommendation to people about which one to go to, I think Kinneroden, the mainland's northernmost point, is probably the most interesting as far as it's very remote compared to the other 2. And so it just has a more wild, into the earth kind of feel to it. So if I had to recommend one, I'd go with that one. But it's also much more difficult to get to. I forget how far you have to hike from a road, maybe 10 or 15 miles. So it's a good ways off.
You mentioned that you had some concerns about being frozen at the end of your walk if you were to go south and north. But being such an experienced hiker, when you start off on these trips, do you have any concerns anymore, or is there anything that causes you anxiety?
Your experience can buy you, I think, a little bit more flexibility, but it can't save you if you get yourself into too much trouble with cold or wet or anything. My biggest concern up in the beginning was it was still cold because it's still really cold up there and rainy. It's very rainy up there. So it was just, and it's remote. So like, it's mostly just trying not to get yourself into a situation where you can no longer help yourself because there's not anyone coming up there. I did carry a satellite emergency beacon, like an InReach, the Lorem InReach, which I think they're owned by Garmin now. So if I got like a broken leg or something, I could have at least hit that and hopefully got some help. Anytime you go out into the wild, it doesn't matter who you are or how much you've done. You have to be careful and you have to have a lot of respect for nature. It's definitely the boss out there. And it doesn't take much to mess up badly. I think you see a lot of people who don't know what they're doing get in trouble, and you see a lot of people who absolutely know what they're doing get into trouble. And usually it's because they've, for just that minute, lost that little bit of respect they should have had for nature. So Yeah, no, I think anyone should always have a little bit of fear in them.
Let's talk a little bit about your gear setup. I mean, what did you have for a pack?
I took a REI pack. It's kind of just as a pack I had. I thought the trip was going to be about 6,000 miles or so. And so I thought whatever pack I took I'd probably replace it in the middle of the trip. But this little REI, it was like one of their lightweight REI packs. It actually held up pretty well. So I just used it the whole way. I thought about replacing it once, but then I was just like, yeah, I like it enough. Some of the outside mesh broke a little bit here and there, but for the most part, it was pretty good. And I actually really liked that aspect of it because I think a lot of times people get too focused on gear. And they're like, oh, if I just had this piece of equipment or that piece of equipment, I would be able to do this. And really, the gear makes a difference. Good gear matters, but it's not as important as people think. It's more about just the will. So yeah, I had the REI pack. I took a tarp tent Rainbow, which is a tarp tent is a really good company. It's not super well known outside
That's
of long distance hiking, but
the Henry Shires.
yeah. But I took a Rainbow from him, which is a really light one-person tent. Very, very good. It worked well the whole trip. And then I had a really good sleeping bag, a Western Mountaineering sleeping bag that has served me very well for about 10 years and kept me warm on this trip through some very cold conditions. It was a 10-degree bag, so
is that Daniel? Is that a down bag?
Yeah, it's a down bag. So it was definitely one of the things I wrapped in a couple layers of plastic every day just to make sure it would stay dry.
What are you doing for cooking?
I used like a little alcohol stove, just that you use denatured alcohol, because I figured that would be pretty easy to find, and it was fairly simple to find. And then once I got down into like Germany, I just dropped it and just ate food that I got along the way, because at that point you're walking through little towns all the time, so getting fresh food is easier than cooking.
What about your clothing? Anything special or just a basic layering system?
Just the basic layering system, rain gear, I had a down jacket for warmth, because I knew this would be a pretty cold trip. And yeah, basic principles, keep it light and then layer it up.
What about trekking poles?
I love trekking poles. I'm a big fan of trekking poles. I think especially up, in Norway and Sweden, where I was going cross country a lot. I was fording a lot of rivers, real rocky terrain. I think trekking poles they save you from I think they save me from ankle injuries. They definitely help a lot in river crossings. So yeah, I have definitely a pair of trekking poles that I love.
Do you know the size of that backpack?
I think it's a 45-liter backpack. Yeah, it's not giant. It's not super, super small, but it's not giant either. I'm a pretty lightweight backpacker. I'm not like an ultralight backpacker, but I try and keep it lighter.
How did you navigate?
I use GPS app, Gaia GPS on my phone, and then have the GPS track of at least parts of the trip. And then other places, I just looked at a map and would walk small roads. I'd say about 60-70% of the trip I had a GPS track of some trail somewhere, and then the other percent was just guesses and looking at roads and paths and trying to figure something out. But yeah, it worked well. I took two phones, one that was my actual phone and then an old phone as a backup, because I wasn't really comfortable with just having one source of navigation. I thought about printing out maps, but the logistics of that were just too much for this long of a trip, where I didn't have a reliable way to send them to myself. So that way I kind of had two options as far as navigation goes, in case, I slipped and fell and broke one of them, or, at the end of the day, I always try to make sure I was mentally aware of where I was. If I had, if all things went bad, then you can always at least get yourself out to a road or something. You have to go in a certain direction.
So are you using a special app for this?
Yeah, I used an app called Gaia GPS, which lets you download maps, like topo maps for offline use, so you don't have to have an internet connection.
So is this spelled
when you're
like
out in the wild?
It's spelled GUIA?
GAIA.
Okay.
Yeah. It's on, I'm pretty sure it's on both Android and iPhones. There might be some other ones that do the same thing. I don't know. Haven't looked, but it's worked well for me so far, so long.
What are you doing for charging your phone?
I brought a solar panel, but then I realized that up north, even though when I started, you have 24 hours of sunlight because it's the summer and you're above the Arctic Circle. But after I realized that the sun is still so low, the angle is so low that you really don't get a good solid charge off of the panels, at least not enough to keep things going because I ride a lot with my phone. So I need a pretty good charge. So then I switched to a couple of battery packs and used those for pretty much the whole trip. They're heavy, but you got to feed your phone addiction. So it is what it is.
Well, for writing on your phone, you must spell pretty well because I didn't see a lot of spelling mistakes. Some bloggers who do that are like the worst spellers ever, and it's you see all those spelling mistakes that make it onto their blog.
You're very kind. Sometimes I go back and read blogs. I'm like, oh, I missed all these errors, but I was like, it's on my phone. It's like it's a good excuse.
So, hey, let's talk a little bit about the adventure in terms of the countries you went through. Maybe you can tell me, start at Norway and work through each country. Tell me, one or two good things and one or two challenges that you remember from walking through those places.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of think of Norway and Sweden as very similar. I'm sure there's a Norwegian and a Swedish person somewhere who are like, what? But the challenges of those countries are very similar. And the great side of things, they have this system of land use law, basically, that gives you the right to cross any land, public or private, and camp on it. Any wild land. So you don't have to really worry about property boundaries like you would in the United States. You're not going to be trespassing. Now, you don't want to be like camping next to someone's house. That's not right. But as long as you're respectful, people are very open to you walking around and going wherever. So that was one of my favorite things about Norway and Sweden is that feeling. And Finland. I was just in Finland for a little while, but they all have the same right, or it's similar, right? It's that feeling of just open adventure that you look out at a landscape and you're like, well, if I wanted to go there, I could go over there. Look, that mountain looks interesting. Let me go over there. And it's just great. It's absolutely wonderful. I think it's a great system. And also, it's just a wild, open countryside. Like, you're so far north, especially in the northern parts of these countries, that there's so few trees that the whole landscape is just open. And there's not a lot of people, so it's open and wild. And it's basically like you and some reindeer and just an open landscape. And the mountains are not gigantic, but they look bigger than they are because there's no tree lines. So just that wildness of Norway and Sweden and Finland was amazing. I mean, I think the hard part of those is, they're pretty expensive countries, so for food or equipment, if you need to replace anything, it's going to be way, way more expensive than you'd have to pay in the United States. And they are very remote. So even if you have the money, you might not be able to find the equipment in some of the small towns. There was a town I went to early on that had 40 people in it was the town. That's it. So you think that's like an apartment building in most cities. So that's what I found. I did think that it was amazing. Most people there did speak at least some English, so it was pretty easy language-wise, and very kind people. But I found that throughout the whole trip, that people were very nice. Once I crossed over from Sweden to Denmark, I crossed on a ferry. It gets a little more crowded because then you're more on like the main continent of Europe. It's much more population. Cities are much closer. There's not as much wild space. And then the challenges really picked up a lot. In Germany, there's a lot of small villages after small villages. And then I actually went through a couple of bigger cities. But in the good side is it's real easy to get food and you start eating a lot better. But it becomes very difficult to camp because it's not like there's just not a lot of space. So you're kind of constantly stealth camping, and I'm not really sure about the legality of it all. I just try and always camp where I'm not going to bother anybody, and then I always am kind of like camping late, leaving early. People don't even know you're there, but
let me interrupt you for a moment and then talk about that. So about what percentage of the time were you camping versus, like couch surfing or some other arrangement?
I would say about 80 to 90% of the time I camped until I got to the Camino de Santiago, which has its own system of like albergues, which are basically like pilgrim hostels. And so on that section, I kind of used that system. But other than the Camino, I mostly camped. And then, I couch surfed some and stayed with random people I met some other times, but mostly camped. Yeah, it was interesting. I camped in some small little groves of trees sometimes that were just like, you wouldn't think about it if you're not looking for a place to camp.
What about law enforcement? Did you have any run-ins?
I never had any real run-ins with law enforcement. I had in Sweden on my last day in Gothenburg when I was walking into the city. As I was getting into the city, a police car stopped just to ask me where I was going because they had seen me walking down the road like earlier that morning. They were just curious. It wasn't like threatening at all. They were just like, "Wow, we saw you earlier, and we're just so curious." The one time I noticed law enforcement is kind of gets into one of the bigger themes of this trip that I found was once I went through Italy and I started to head west. Crossing the border from Italy to France was the only time I got stopped at a border to check for IDs or passports or whatever. And what I realized is, that was the only time I was moving in the same direction as a lot of the refugees coming from Syria and other places. It was saddening to me to think about, what it would be, that experience must be like for people just trying to flee and save their lives. Of course, for me, it wasn't a problem. I have a passport. It wasn't an issue. But that was the only time I got stopped by police to actually be checked.
Let's continue on with the country by country. So you were in Germany.
Germany, I think, overall had the best chocolate for the price. Not the best chocolate overall, but best chocolate for the price. A little inside information. It also has an incredible selection of gummy candy wherever you go in Germany. And there's little things like that are what I kind of really love looking back at this trip. It was the kind of small quirks that you find. After Germany, I really got caught by winter in Germany. It finally started to snow on me. And so then I was trying to get through Switzerland to get to Italy. And to do that, I had to cross the Alps, which did not look good for me because it was going to be in December. But I had met this Swiss guy way back in Norway when, maybe the first week or so of the trip, I was walking and I randomly ran into these two Swiss guys who were fishing. And we talked for a little while, and I had told them about my plan to eventually cross the Alps. And this older fellow named Fritz, he was like, "Hey," I was asking him about the Alps. He said, "Well, why don't you just worry about that when you get to Switzerland?" And then he gave me his number, and so I called him and I said, "Hey, Fritz, I'm in Switzerland. I made it. You think we can still cross the Alps?" And he's like, "Yeah, you can cross them, and I'm going to help you cross them." So I stayed with him, and then he met me up, where the trail was headed into the mountains to cross at this pass called Gotthard Pass. And he met me, he brought some snowshoes, and the two of us went across the pass together, crossing. It was actually a really light snow year, or the snow still hadn't come very much that year. So we crossed, maybe 6 miles of snow to get across the pass to the southern side of the Alps. It was a lovely experience just meeting him so long ago and just getting to go across with him. And then finally getting over the Alps and getting in, knowing that it was downhill into Italy from there, was amazing. And then once you hit Italy, the food instantly gets 100 times better. The Italian food was amazing. And there's a warmth. It's interesting, I met nice people the whole way, and I don't mean to say this as anything negative to the more Northern Europe folks, but in Italy, I noticed that the people themselves were a little warmer in general. Like they're just like more lively and more talkative and more warm. And it wasn't like they were any more or less nice to me. It was just just like a cultural warmth that was there versus like in the North, it was more like a respectful distance. Like people would, once you talk to them, they would open up, but it was almost like the default there was to let people have their space. Versus in Italy, it felt more like people were like, "Hey, what are you doing?" They were, much more involved. That was interesting just to feel that. It was definitely, you could feel that change as you went across. And then from Italy, you head into France, which of course has amazing bakeries. I know I keep talking about food, but that's what it comes down to. On a long distance hike, eventually just talk about food. France had such good bakeries in so many little towns, and each one had a bakery that actually put on weight while walking across France. It's incredible to be able to put on weight while walking, 20 miles a day or so. And then you reach the Camino de Santiago. Well, there's Camino routes all through Europe, but the main route starts right on the French side of the Spanish-French border. And so once I got there, everything really changed a lot because then I was on like a really well-known path. And I was walking with other people because until that point, I really had mostly walked alone, other than those couple of days with Fritz up in the Alps. And it was an incredible change in the way I felt that people were perceiving me because on the whole trip, I never shaved. So like in Norway, I looked, like a little scruffy. But by the time I was in Italy and France, I was looking really rough beard-wise. And you start to pick up on just very subtle judgments from the people around you, not verbal, not anything crazy, but just like little physical things and just kind of like a fear that people have of you just because of the way you look. And as soon as I stepped on to like the main Camino route, that changed because suddenly I was no longer this like scary bearded man walking down the street. I was a pilgrim on the Camino de Santiago, and they could place me like within the context of their world. And it was an interesting thing to feel that shift, which is something, it made me think a lot about, just stereotypes and racism and sexism that happens, and for me, it's not the biggest of deals because I can shave and I can change my clothes or whatever and everything will be, I'll fit right back into society. But you think in some places, you can't change the color of your skin. You can't change your sex or gender. If someone doesn't like you because of that, then there's nothing you can do about that. And it really made me think a lot harder about that concept of just kind of the subtle discrimination that goes on a daily basis. And I don't know, I don't have a good solution for it.
Well, Daniel, I wondered about this, and my question to you is, if you tried to do this type of a walk in the United States, what, as scary bearded guy, what do you think that experience would be like? Because I have a hunch you would be stopped by law enforcement a lot more than you got stopped at in Europe.
Yeah. I'm not certain because I've done long walks in the United States, but it's always been on a very well-known route, like the Appalachian Trail. No one questions a bearded dude walking around the Appalachian Trail. My guess is that, yeah, it's a way different experience. And I think even, even talking to some of my friends who aren't, white men, I'm half Cuban, but I totally will pass as a non-Latino. So it's not something that is obvious, but talking to friends, who maybe have darker skin, women who hike alone on some of these trails, and just kind of like the subtle things that they experience, it's a totally different thing. And it's a problem. I think that the hiking community in general needs to do a better job of A, recognizing that it exists, and B, figuring out how to make these trails and spaces more accommodating to people of all races, genders, religions, sexual orientations, everything. Because I do think, it's just something we all need to do a better job of recognizing and trying to make sure everyone feels welcome. Because, my thought is these trails are really hard enough. They're hard enough when you don't have to worry about someone judging you for something that's totally ridiculous. I don't know. It's just we got to do a better job of making sure these spaces are safe for everybody. But yeah, I think it would be a way different experience in the U.S., especially if you're off the main trails. If you're just going through random cities.
Did you hike this solo, or did you pick up any hiking partners along the way?
I hiked it alone until I got to the Camino de Santiago. And then I ended up hiking kind of with the same group of people, the whole trail, from the Spanish-French border all the way to Santiago, which is on the western edge of Spain. And then one of those people hiked south with me all the way through Portugal. I did end up hiking with, friends, which was really nice. It was a good change of pace to have constant companions. He could really share some of the highs and lows of a hike with, because when you're alone, it's just like there's no one to share that with. And I think it makes the highs and lows more extreme, especially the lows, because you can really get down when you're alone, because you don't have anyone to kind of take you back and say, hey, it's okay, to be frustrated. Hey, it's okay, don't worry, tomorrow it might not rain. You can really get in your head when you're alone, but when you're with other people, they can really help lift you up. So that was very, very nice. And it happened at a good time, because by the time I reached the Camino de Santiago, I was, I don't know, probably 4,500 miles into this trip, and so I was pretty worn down and beaten up, and so it kind of was like the last boost I needed to kind of finish the trail.
Do you have any tricks? I mean, if you were by yourself and you didn't have that person to pick you up, I mean, what kind of tricks or what have you learned in order to keep yourself motivated?
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple. One is, I think it's really important to always check your mindset about how you're viewing things. The thing I always think about is a rainy day. Like, you can think about a rainy day as like, oh, this is miserable. It's raining. Oh, I'm getting wet. That's not good. My shoes are getting wet. And kind of just get real down and kind of like that downward spiral. Or you can kind of really focus on the great things about the rain, like the sound of it hitting the trees, the pavement, or the feel of it like on your skin. And just like the like if you're hiking in a desert, you're like, oh, there's going to be water sources. And so if you think of it, or like, this is an adventure, like it's raining and I'm going to survive it and I'm going to like power through this. And if you can really flip your mindset to that mindset of adventure, I might have talked about this on the kayaking trip too, because that's where I really thought about it a lot as well, which is, you just got to think of it like it can either be a burden or an adventure, And if you think about it as a burden, it will be a burden. If you think about it as an adventure, it'll be an adventure. That, I think, is really important, that perspective that you have. And whenever you're feeling down, always try and flip that script in your head to something that's a little more positive. And I find that very helpful. I also think that setting small goals is really important on big trips. Like, you can't try and walk all the way to Spain from Norway in one go. You have to think, all right, well, from Norway, eventually I'll get to Finland. And then in Finland, I'll get to Sweden. And then I'll cross the border back into Norway. And you keep these smaller goals, or, maybe even just the next rest or the next lake or the next little town you're going to get food in, or, bigger, like slightly bigger goals, like the next country, or I'm going to get across the Alps. And those small goals really help you kind of feel like you're still moving forward and you're getting somewhere, when the big goal is still very far away and very difficult to reach. So it helps you just kind of feel like you're not just stuck in place and that everything's more possible. The thing I like to say is, like, you only reach the end you only get to the final goal on the last day. So if that's the thing that's really pulling you forward, it's just not going to be enough on like the middle, 100 days before the end. It's just not going to be enough. So you always got to have little goals that you can set your heart on.
Yeah, I pulled a few quotes out from your blog, and one of them kind of that applies here is, I breathe it in, I smile, I keep walking.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the way it is. Yeah, you just got to keep going. Like, even when you're down, just chill, take it in, and keep going.
When you were talking about the positives of the rain, I was thinking, another positive is it washes away the pollution for a while.
Yeah, absolutely.
Did you experience any? I know a lot of the areas you were kind of wild, empty places, but did you go through any places that were kind of more polluted than you thought they would be?
I didn't really see that much on this trip. Mainly in Europe is very much developed, almost everywhere. So it wasn't so much pollution as just people that were everywhere. There's really not a lot of wild spaces left, versus in Scandinavia, there's tons of wild spaces. It's like almost all wild space. And so it was more just like the population, and it wasn't like a pollution thing. There wasn't like smokestacks and stuff like that that I noticed particularly anywhere. You do see a little more trash as you get south, just here and there. But mostly the difference is that there's just not a lot of wild space, which actually made me really appreciate the United States and the wild lands that we have protected here, and the amount that we have protected, especially out west. But even in the east, we've got good chunks of land that is just wild still. And it's just not something that they have a lot of in Europe. I don't think we quite appreciate how special that is in the United States. How special it is and how much we really need to work to make sure it stays protected and stays wild, because it's a real treasure that we have out here.
Did you have to be concerned about any wildlife? Were there any bears in any sections, or any wolves or anything like that?
Not really. Supposedly there are bears and wolves in Norway and Sweden and Finland, but everyone I talked to up there was like, you won't see any. They're so rare. And I think they do hunt them to some degree, so they're pretty shy about people. Yeah, that was it. Probably the most dangerous wildlife was Italy, France, and Spain and Portugal all have lots of dogs, neighborhood, like just dogs that people have at their house. And sometimes they get out of the fence, and then it's probably the most dangerous. I never had one actually attack me, but I had a couple get real threatening. So that was about as dangerous as it got. I did have a reindeer that followed me in Norway for about 10 miles. It was like right behind me the whole way. It was like sometimes in front of me, sometimes behind me. I didn't know what to do because most of the reindeer stay pretty far away from you. But this one in particular was just like, he was like a puppy following me around. And I got real confused. And so I eventually ran across a Norwegian, like a little village. And I ran into a Norwegian guy and I was like, hey, what do I do with this reindeer? And he was like, oh, that reindeer. And he actually recognized the reindeer. Apparently it lives in the town and the kids feed it bread. So I had a loaf of bread in my pack. And I think it had smelled it and it figured that I was going to give it bread. But it was pretty wild. It wasn't threatening, though. It was just really fun. I felt like I was auditioning for Santa Claus or something, my own reindeer.
How close was it to you?
It ranged from, a couple feet away to disappear for a minute or two. And then like sometimes it would be right next to me. Like once I stopped on the trail because I was trying to make sure where I was going to go. And it like nudged me with its antlers, just not like meanly, just like, why did you stop? Keep going. I mean, it was close enough to touch. I wasn't trying to touch it because I didn't want to like scare it or something, but yeah, it was right there.
Yeah, you don't want to get kicked by a reindeer.
Yeah, I mean those antlers are pretty massive too. I wouldn't like my chances. They're not giant creatures, but still.
Well, what do you think was the biggest lesson that you learned from this adventure?
I think that this one really was it was a lot about people and cultures. And, like I was talking earlier about just kind of like subtle biases and stuff that I think we all carry within us and we all need to examine. And I know myself included, I'm not saying I'm perfect in this in any way, shape, or form, but just those little subtle biases and how impactful they can be to people, even when you don't realize you're impacting them. And also the other way, because in many places, it wasn't just like, oh, that people were giving me dirty looks or something, but oftentimes people would stop, ask me how I'm doing, what I'm doing. I ended up staying in lots of people's houses along the way. And so like on the flip side of that is this amazing experience we can all have if we're really open to other human beings and meeting them and sharing stories and our lives with them. The trip, actually the last night on the trip, I was walking through a little village and I got stopped by this very nice French couple who lived in southern Spain, and they invited me to their house and had me spend the night. They cooked me food, and it was like it felt like the right way to end the trip, because along this whole trip, even from Fritz, who I met in Norway, who guided me across the Alps, there's a whole bunch of people in Italy that I met. In Germany, I stayed with with someone else I met in Norway. I mean, there's like all these people that were willing to open up their lives and their homes and their hearts to me and my trip and help me along. It really encouraged me about just the world that we can have if we all are a little more accepting of each other, which is weird because it's not what I thought this trip would be about. I thought it'd be about, walking and seeing pretty mountains, and it was to some degree, but that was the thing that really, really stuck with me about this trip, was just both the sadness of what exists sometimes in our world in terms of bias and prejudice and stuff, but also the hope and the potential that we have if we really can get past that and look past that and to the better side of our humanity, I think.
What about the adventure are you most proud of?
I think what I'm most proud of is that I went on a really random route that was not direct and not fast, but was the most interesting adventure I think I could have had. Like, I didn't have to cross the Alps. You could have easily just gone from Germany into France, skip the Alps. But I thought the Alps should be part of this. So, even though it was another, I don't know how long, it probably took me another month just because I did that. Or in Spain, I could have gone right when you get to Spain, you can go straight south to the southern tip of Spain, which is the southern tip of Europe. But instead, I wanted to hike the Camino de Santiago. So I went way far west, much farther than I could have gone, and then down all the way through Portugal, which I didn't even have to go through. And I think it's that I never really lost that spirit of adventure and just trying to get the trip over with, I think that's what I'm very proud of, is that like I never, even when it was getting hard and, in the middle of these trips, sometimes you're just like, oh, this is really hard. And you start to think about the end a little bit more. I never gave up on the idea that no, this isn't about the end or the beginning or anything like that. It's just about the adventure along the way. So I think that's probably what I'm most proud of.
Well, you wrote a lot about the adventure. Do you plan on turning that into a book?
I know some of the people who read my blog are always harassing me about turning it into a book. And I do hope that one day I will, but I still owe them a book about the kayaking trip, and that has not happened yet. So, so maybe I hope so. But if it is, it'll be a little while.
Well, do you mind? I pulled this passage out about this woman, this bakery that you went to in France, and I wanted to read it if you didn't mind, because I thought it was just awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
All right. The old woman moves with a slow patience, taking care to wrap my pastries just so in paper in a box. She looks up at me with the baguette in one hand, squints at my backpack, and asks if I want the bread cut in half so it will fit inside. She does it all in French, of course, but her kind face and gestures convey the meaning. It seems such a small kindness, cutting the bread in half for me. But it's the first time anyone has offered. I feel seen. She really looked at me, saw the backpack, saw that I would have trouble fitting the baguette easily, saw that it would be simple for her to help. It's a small thing, but it makes me feel connected to her for a moment, cared for. Unquote. Man, that's great. That's awesome, man. You just write that? Like that just came right out of you?
Well, you got a lot of time to walk and think, but yeah, I mean, that was really, that's how it happened that day. It was, it was in France. France was a tough leg of the trip because it was very much, not the end, but far past the middle. So like, you're really struggling at that point mentally. And so, this is an area where there's no real good trails. It's constantly like trying to walk down roads and stuff. And yeah, I still remember that bakery. It's these little human moments where you see each other as other human beings. I think that really, I don't know. I think that's what really matters. It matters a lot that we start to see each other as other human beings.
It looks like you did some experimenting with YouTube and we're doing some videos of the trip. What was your experience with that?
Yeah, I did. It was great. I wanted to just make some videos along the way to kind of give people a visual. And I had never really done much YouTube videos before, so this is new. It was great. Actually, if you guys want to go see that reindeer, there's a whole video. I think it's the 6th or 7th video thing, all about this reindeer that followed me. It was fun. It was a little time consuming, like a little too much, along with the blog. But the real problem, it ends at the as I crossed the Alps in Switzerland is the last video. I'm going to eventually go back and make the rest, but my phone broke. So I lost my ability to make videos in the middle of the trip. So that was the downside of it, but it was fun to make. And I don't know, I really like sharing these trips because I know there's lots of people who might never get the chance to do one of these kinds of adventures. And so I want to make sure they have at least a glimpse into them.
So were you doing everything on your phone, the editing and everything?
Yeah, all the editing on my phone. I was amazed because the last time I edited any sort of video, it was on a computer and it was much more of a hassle. But yeah, it was all on a phone. Was
there a specific app that you used?
I think I used an app called Power Director on Android. I'm not sure. I think iMovie on the iPhones is pretty good too, from what I hear, but I haven't actually used it too much. But yeah, Power Director. It's a very powerful little video editor for a phone. I mean, for what you can do on a phone, it's good. It's impressive.
Well, Daniel, I don't know if you mind talking about it or not, but I'm just kind of curious how do you earn a living and how do you pay for these things? Do you just kind of work a job and then have an adventure and then find a job and work an adventure, or how do you do this?
Yeah, that's kind of it. I mean, I saved up a lot of money after, I went to law school and then I was a lawyer, saved up some money there. And then I live really simply on and off trails. So I try and save as much as I can between adventures. And after this one, I got a more legitimate legal job again, doing climate change litigation. So at some point on this trip, I was like, I got to do a little bit more to help the world. So I wanted to get back into important fights. But yeah, I think basically you just got to save up money and then live cheaply. And then also these kinds of adventures are not that expensive because you're mostly just camping. So it depends. You could easily spend lots of money on a trip like this, stay in hotels all the time, eat at restaurants all the time. But I mostly just ate out of supermarkets and I camped. So basically you're buying food and replacement gear, and that's about it.
Do you know what's next for you? Do you have any big adventures on the horizon?
Yeah, I don't have any more like wilderness adventures. I'm really trying to look at this job fighting climate change as an adventure in its own way. I think it's one of the biggest fights that is going to involve, all of us basically having to change the system we're growing up in. So I try and keep that perspective as this is an adventure too. It's a different kind. It's like one of the biggest questions and fights that we have is how do we solve this crisis that's looming on our planet? So that's my adventure currently. And I'm sure that eventually I'll go on some more adventures. I'm trying to figure out to do, shorter, weekend, week-long kind of stuff that's maybe a little more intense, but shorter duration.
Well, maybe you can combine the YouTube plus the long-distance hiking plus the law career in kind of a, celebrity online, attorney or something.
Yeah, who knows? I have no idea. Right now, honestly, I'm overwhelmed by getting back into the law. It's just like trying to keep my head above the water.
Well, how can people connect with you if they want to learn more?
Absolutely. Go to my website, predictablylost.com, and that is the best way. There's a contact form on there. I'm happy to try and answer any questions I can to help people on either this trip, or if you're into kayaking, I can try and help you a little with that as well. A lot of people helped me on these trips, so I'm always looking to give back in that way. Yeah, so predictablylost.com is the website. It has the blog, has contact information. You can also find, if you want to see the videos on YouTube, if you go to YouTube / I think Predictably Lost, you'll find them. Or if you search for Predictably Lost on YouTube, you'll find them. And on Instagram, you can find me on Predictably Lost. That's about it. If you can't find me after all those options, then I don't know.
Well, Daniel, thanks again for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. And congratulations on completing that big adventure. And hey, thanks for having faith in me all those 5 years ago when you said yes to do the interview before, I even had the podcast.
Hey, I continue to think this is just great. I mean, just getting all these adventurous stories out there. I'm so happy that you've kept it up. It's just so great. I have to go back and listen to some of the past episodes I've missed because I'm like, oh, maybe I'll find other new adventures to go on.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
I'll keep doing it as long as it's fun for me. And there's some amazing adventures. You'd be surprised. I mean, I'm surprised myself all the time when I look out there and try to recruit to see what I see people doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The world's full of amazing adventures.
Thank you for listening. If you want to support the show, here are a few simple ways. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the podcast. You can like the show on Facebook or follow along on Twitter at The Pursuit Zone. And you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or iTunes or wherever else that you listen to the podcasts. This episode was recorded on March 1st, 2018. For the show notes and more great adventure travel podcasts, visit thepursuitzone.com.